Welcome to the mysterious casebook. Tonight, a quiet manner hides a secret in the garden room, a whisper of betrayal, a vanished heirloom, and a truth waiting beneath the roses. Where in the world are you joining us from? Now, pour yourself something warm, and let the mystery begin. It began, as such things often do, with something entirely harmless. The annual chrysanthemum tea at the vicarage had once again assembled the good ladies of St. Mary Mead into one sitting room, where china cups rattled on saucers and polite conversation teetered on the brink of scandal. Mrs. Bantry, resplendent in a slightly outdated mauve hat, spoke of pruning roses with the same gravity one might afford a national crisis. Young Mrs. Beale from the manor offered slices of Dundee cake with the frantic cheer of a woman hosting her first committee gathering without supervision, and presiding over the whole affair, like a discreet queen behind enemy lines, sat Miss Marple, her needles rhythmically clacking out a cardigan sleeve and her eyes entirely occupied with other people's expressions. Outside, the November fog pressed up against the leaded windows, softening the garden beyond into greys and silhouettes. The garden room, an odd Victorian attachment with flaking turquoise walls and a forgotten scent of camphor, had been left open that afternoon for coats and conversation. It was, as the vicar's wife noted with a light grimace, rather cold but ever so useful. What none of them yet knew as they passed seed catalogues and half-eaten ginger biscuits was that the fog would not lift. Not for several days. And in its thickening silence, something long hidden would come into view. "Have you been in the garden room?" asked Mrs. Price Ridley in a voice that was at once idle and loaded. Mrs. Bantry, never one to shirk a mystery, perked up. "Not since I put my gloves down. No." "Why?" Mrs. Price Ridley did not answer directly. Instead, she fussed with the clasp of her handbag and lowered her voice. "I think there's something strange in there. The curtain's been drawn side only, and I don't recall it being so before. And there's a well, a smell, not altogether pleasant." At this, Miss Hartnell, who had the moral certainty of a lighthouse and the subtlety of a foghorn, stood up with purpose. "If there's something to be seen, or smelled, I shall see it for myself." And with that, a tide of wool and tweed swept toward the rear of the vicarage. Miss Marple did not rise at once. She merely set down her knitting and followed a full 15 seconds later. Long enough not to seem eager. Just long enough to watch the drama form without disturbing its shape. The garden room was indeed colder than the rest of the house. A damp chill lingered beneath the scent of dried lavender and mothballs. The group paused just inside the doorway. Someone had drawn the right-hand curtain halfway across the window. A streak of mud ran along the sill. Below it, on the faded rug near the chaise lounge, something small and dark lay curled like a dead leaf. Mrs. Bantry gasped. "Is that?" It was. A glove, a child's glove, embroidered with a delicate violet thread. Strange enough in itself. But what made it unsettling was that no child had been at the tea, and certainly none who'd have left a glove damp with soil and something darker. Miss Marple crouched, her knees protesting only slightly, and examined the glove without touching it. Her expression did not change, but her eyes, pale as morning frost, settled on the pattern of the embroidery. Violet thread, a curling design. A memory flickered. "Oh, it's probably just something left over from the jumble," Mrs. Beale said with nervous brightness. "I've been meaning to clear this room so many odds and ends from the old parish sales Miss Marple stood. And yet," she said mildly, "it seems very recently left." Mrs. Price Ridley turned on her. "Really, Jane, how can you possibly tell?" Miss Marple looked not at the glove, but at the window latch above it. "There's condensation on the pane," she said quietly. "Except just Terese?" A small handprint, as if someone had drawn back the curtain quite recently, with rather damp fingers. They stared. The fog outside made the handprint visible now, Small, faint, but undeniably real. Miss Hartnell bristled. Who would leave such a thing? It's all rather staged, if you ask me. Oh, I don't think so, Miss Marple said gently. Not staged, but I wonder if it was meant to be found. The room was very still. Behind them, from the sitting room, came the clink of a teaspoon dropped too hard. Mrs. Bantry turned toward the sound, frowning. I'll fetch the vicar, she said. But by the time she returned, something had shifted. The curtain is now fully closed. The glove is gone. And in its place, tucked into the folds of the old chaise lounge cushion, was a single pressed violet brittle, dry and unmistakably placed. The conversation that resumed afterward was not quite the same. It took on a slightly breathless, listening quality, as if each woman now spoke into a room already half occupied by other voices. Miss Marple did not mention the flower, but she thought of a case from her youth. A governess, a locked drawer, and a violet scent that lingered long after innocence had fled. Outside, the fog pressed closer, patient and unmoving. The pressed violet lay as if it had been waiting all along, its fragile petals trembling with the draught that had crept in through the half-latched garden door. No one had seen anyone enter or leave, and yet the atmosphere inside the vicarage had subtly altered, as though the air itself now carried intent. Miss Marple remained near the chaise lounge, her gaze flicking once more to the cushion's faint indentations, the lingering warmth discernible only to one who knew how to listen to silence. Her fingers remained clasped gently in front of her, an elderly posture of modesty that belied the analytical cyclone turning just beneath. Behind her, Mrs. Bantry returned with the vicar, Reverend Caldecott, a kindly man with a permanent squint of mild befuddlement. His vestments still bore faint traces of potting soil, having been called mid-inspection of the churchyard chrysanthemums. I do hope no one's been upset, he murmured with the nervous cadence of someone who knew very well that someone most certainly had. Mrs. Beale rushed to explain, smoothing her skirt repeatedly. Just a glove, vicar, left behind in the garden room, and then, well, it disappeared. But now there's a flower, a violet, not a fresh one. Pressed. Pressed, he repeated, as though the word carried ecclesiastical significance. Miss Hartnell interjected crisply. It's all rather theatrical. If you ask me, someone is playing a tasteless prank. Miss Marple glanced up, her tone as mild as lukewarm tea. Or perhaps not playing at all. Some messages aren't meant to be loud. Reverend Caldecott blinked at her, unsure whether he had just received a theological insight or a polite correction. The party broke into uneasy murmurs, diffusing across the vicarage like smoke seeking cracks in old plaster. One by one, the ladies of St. Mary Mead returned to their teacups, though the cups remained mostly untouched. Mrs. Price Ridley hovered near the sideboard, her ear tuned toward every fragment of conversation like a wartime wireless operator. Someone's child, perhaps, she offered too loudly. That glove looked awfully small, and the embroidery is very continental. Foreign. French, maybe. Mrs. Bantry stiffened. There's no French child in the village. Well, someone was seen walking along the lane behind the vicarage yesterday. Long coat. Not quite a man, not quite a boy, according to old Mr. Toller. Toller's nearly blind, muttered Mrs. Beale. Even so, said Mrs. Price Ridley, eyes gleaming. He's not deaf. Said the figure was humming. Miss Marple sipped her tea slowly. Did he say what was being hummed? Mrs. Price Ridley blinked. Something odd. Church music, perhaps. He couldn't place it. Miss Marple gave a small nod, then turned her gaze once more toward the garden room's half-closed door. The garden beyond remained shrouded, its paths lost in mist, but the faint outline of the sundial could still be made out through the pane. A curious relic from another age. It bore an inscription in Latin illegible, now through weathering and ivy, and a reputation for being always slightly wrong. The vicar cleared his throat. Perhaps we ought to let this matter lie until after the fog is cleared. Children's things turn up in the oddest places. The room could use a good airing, that's all. His appeal to reason had the softness of damp bread. Miss Hartnell sniffed. Still, I'd not be leaving any valuables near that room. Not with strange hands about. From the corner, young Emily Crampton, barely 20, rarely heard for the first time. But nothing was taken, was it? They all turned to look at her as though a chair had addressed the room. Emily flushed but held her ground. I mean, if someone wanted to steal, why leave a flower? Mrs. Bantry blinked. A fair question, my dear. Miss Marple studied the girl with quiet interest. You've been quite observant, Emily. The girl flushed deeper. I was just thinking. It didn't seem like a prank. It felt sad. Silence fell. From the mantel clock a single chime echoed, marking the half-hour as though drawing a breath through the house. I think, said Miss Marple softly, there is more truth in that observation than we realize. A beat passed, and then the vicar, with the nervous optimism of a man overwhelmed by women, clapped his hands faintly. Well, let us not fall into mystery when we come together for fellowship. Cake, anyone? Mrs. Beale's Dundee is especially well risen today, but the appetite for sponge had vanished. The ladies dispersed in pairs and murmurs, floating out into the grey afternoon like ghosts in sensible shoes. On the way out, Miss Hartnell gave the curtain an extra tug as if daring it to move again. Miss Marple was last to leave the garden room. As she reached for her gloves, her own gloves, she paused. The cushion where the violet had been now held only an indentation. The flower was gone. She did not remark upon it. Instead, she walked quietly to the umbrella stand near the door, where her sensible black parasol leaned slightly to one side. There, nestled beside its base, was a scrap of paper. Torn along one edge, the ink slightly smudged. She glanced around, no one nearby. She picked it up. 3 words. Not your garden. No signature, no explanation. Just that. She folded the scrap and slipped it into her pocket as naturally as if it were a forgotten shopping list. Outside, a light drizzle had begun, tapping gently against the vicarage hedges. The kind of rain that wasn't loud enough to disturb thought, only to make one walk a little slower on purpose. As Miss Marple stepped onto the gravel, her eyes lifted once more to the mist-shrouded sundial. A garden, after all, is not always a place for beauty. Sometimes it is where we bury the things we dare not bring inside. Miss Marple's footsteps were soundless on the wet gravel as she moved along the vicarage path. Not hurrying, but not idle either. The drizzle clung to her coat in tiny beads, and her gaze remained fixed on the sundial, which stood half consumed by the fog, its gnomon casting no discernible shadow. She paused by the low hedge that bordered the path, and looked back, not at the house, but at the garden-room window where the curtain, drawn hastily earlier, now hung askew. Somewhere deeper in the shrubbery, a bird chirped, then fell abruptly silent. In the afternoon, Miss Marple, came a voice behind her, jarringly cheerful. It was Leonard Tegg, the village constable, striding toward her with the unhurried confidence of a man who rarely dealt with more than the occasional misplaced bicycle or dispute over boundary hedges. "You've missed the excitement," she said gently. He chuckled. "Oh, I've heard already. Word travels faster than a telegram in this village." Mrs. Price Ridley made sure of that. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I imagine she did. Leonard bent down, fiddling with a stone that had loosened on the path. "Vicar says it's nothing. Just an old glove, and a dried flower. Probably fell out of some sewing basket." Miss Marple's eyes remained fixed on the sundial. Yes, it's quite possible. But she made no move to leave. Leonard straightened and followed her gaze. Odd, that sundial. Always seems to point in the wrong direction, even when there's sun. Some things were never meant to tell time, Miss Marple murmured, only to mark its passing. Leonard scratched his head. Well, I suppose I'll write up a little note. For completeness. Not that there's anything to investigate. That depends, she said softly, on what one considers worth investigating. She walked on, leaving the constable half frowning after her. The fog shifted as she turned the corner past the private hedge and entered the lane that curved toward the high street. Here the houses were closer together, old and staid with their curtains drawn too early in the afternoon. In one window, a lace doily hung askew, a detail that caught Miss Marple's eye more surely than any grand gesture. She stopped outside Lavender Cottage and knocked once, twilightly. A moment passed, and then the door creaked open. Emily Crampton stood there, face pale, cardigan clutched too tightly at her waist. "Oh, Miss Marple, I thought I might return your scarf. You left it at the vicarage." Emily blinked, confused. "My scarf?" Miss Marple smiled. "A simple mistake. It must belong to someone else. Still, it gave me an excuse to visit." The girl stepped aside and Miss Marple entered the front room, which smelled faintly of lemons and furniture polish. Everything was perfectly in place, yet overly so, the cushions arranged at exact angles, a single cup on the tray, though two coasters sat beneath it. "I expect your mother's out." Emily hesitated. "She's resting. Her nerves after my brother left, she hasn't been quite herself." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes resting briefly on the empty chair opposite the cup. "That must have been difficult. For both of you." Emily didn't respond at first, then said, "He didn't mean to hurt anyone. He just didn't belong here." "And yet he stayed as long as he could," Miss Marple said kindly. "That often speaks louder than departure." Emily's fingers tightened around the cardigan sleeve. "People don't forgive easily in this village." "No," said Miss Marple. "They don't forget either. But sometimes they remember only what fits their view." Emily looked away, toward the small shelf above the fireplace. Among the trinkets sat a pressed flower in a tiny frame, a violet. Miss Marple's eyes followed hers. "That's lovely. It was my brother's. He found it in an old book from the jumble sale. Said it reminded him that beautiful things often die quietly." There was no sentimentality in her voice, only a quiet echo of something lived and tucked away. Miss Marple stood. "Thank you, Emily. I expect the fog will lift by morning." Emily's mouth moved slightly, as if to say something, but the moment passed. Outside, the street was emptier now. Even the usual clatter from the bakery had dulled into background hush. Miss Marple made her way to the edge of the green, where a narrow path led behind the old schoolhouse to the rectory garden. The fog had turned milky, luminous in its stillness. There, kneeling by the edge of the hedge, was a man in dark trousers and a brown overcoat. He was examining the flower beds with exaggerated care. "Lost something?" she asked lightly. The man straightened abruptly. He was in his early 40s, well-kempt, the kind of face that invited neither trust nor suspicion, blandly pleasant. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" he said. "Henry Marchwood. I'm staying at the Crown. Just visiting friends." "A difficult time to enjoy the scenery," she said, glancing at the sodden leaves. He gave a tight smile. "I like the quiet. Things are simpler here." "So they appear," Miss Marple agreed, though appearances, as we know, can be deceiving. Marchwood's expression twitched ever so slightly. "Indeed." She tilted her head. "You were at the vicarage earlier." He hesitated. "Briefly. Dropped off something for Mrs. Caldecott. She's my cousin's friend." Miss Marple didn't reply immediately. Instead, her gaze settled on the edge of his coat, where a thin line of dried mud traced along the hem, and a single petal clung stubbornly to the wool. "I hope you didn't misplace anything," she said with innocent warmth. "No," he said too quickly. "No, nothing of mine." "Then we must be fortunate." She gave a brief nod. "Enjoy your stay, Mr. Marchwood." As she turned back toward the village green, her hand brushed the note still tucked in her pocket. The ink had dried, but its warning had not. Behind her, the sundial caught a rare moment of sun breaking through the fog, just enough to cast a thin, slanted shadow across the garden path. And there, almost imperceptibly, something in Miss Marple's expression shifted. Miss Marple did not continue toward the green, as she had allowed Mr. Marchwood to believe. Instead, once she was certain his footsteps had faded into the direction of the Crown Inn, she turned down a narrow cut between hedgerows and followed the boundary of the rectory's side garden. The path was rarely used, save by the vicar's cat or small children who knew how to avoid adult eyes. A footpath for secrets, she thought. A crack in the hedge gave her a partial view of the garden room. The window formerly curtained was now fully open. Not drawn back, but opened. That in itself was unusual. The vicarage never aired its windows in such damp. Someone had disturbed it again, and recently. She did not approach. Observation, not interference, had always been her method. Interference was the police's domain. Miss Marple preferred patterns, and here, already, one was beginning to form. A boy's glove, stitched with care but abandoned like guilt. A pressed violet, meaningful only to someone who had once framed one lovingly. A note that claimed possession as if territory had been trespassed. And now Mr. Marchwood mud on his hem and answers just a fraction too quickly. Still, it was all too soon for judgment. Much too soon. She made her way back toward the high street and entered the grocer's, where the bell above the door gave its familiar chime and Mr. Litchfield looked up with a surprised smile. "Miss Marple, thought you'd be indoors today with the fog hanging like an old rug." "I quite enjoy fog," she said, removing her gloves slowly. "It encourages people to speak more freely. They forget who might be watching." He chuckled, then leaned on the counter. "Well, it's kept most in. Except for our foreign visitors." "Seen him?" "Staying at the Crown, always asking after things." "Mr. Marchwood, yes. A charming man. Seems interested in the village history." Litchfield sniffed. "Only the parts no one else bothers with. Old properties, missing deeds, that sort of thing." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Curious taste for a holiday." "Exactly what I thought." She selected a modest wedge of Wensleydale and asked for a half-pound of Darjeeling. As Mr. Litchfield weighed the tea, he added in a tone made casual by effort, "Emily Crampton's been in twice this week. That's unusual." "Oh?" Said her mother wanted a good jam, damson. But her mother never liked damson. Said it stained the teeth. Perhaps she's acquired the taste. Miss Marple's smile didn't reach her eyes. Outside, the fog remained stubborn, though thinner now around the treetops. Miss Marple moved slowly past the dressmakers and down the lane that led to the almshouses, her mind sifting not for answers, but for texture, those small social abrasions that revealed what lay beneath. At the second cottage, she stopped. Mrs. Edgeworth, former head mistress and holder of half the village's secrets, was pruning her lavender with a pair of iron shears. "Jane Marple," she said without turning, "I was wondering when you'd appear." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. "You always had an instinct for timing, Millicent." Mrs. Edgeworth turned then, eyes sharp behind steel-rimmed spectacles. "There's been trouble at the vicarage, but not the kind you call the constable for." "No," said Miss Marple. "The kind that comes wearing gloves and leaves flowers." Mrs. Edgeworth's shears paused mid-air. "She told you then?" "Emily? She's too young to keep grief tidy. And she's alone now. Her mother hasn't left the upstairs room in 3 days. Pretends to nap. But grief doesn't sleep. It listens." Miss Marple looked at the neatly trimmed lavender. "You knew her brother well." Mrs. Edgeworth nodded once. "Bright, quiet. A boy who saw more than he said. Which was, of course, his mistake." "The village didn't take him?" "The village doesn't make a difference, Jane. It papers over it." But under the wallpaper, the wall still cracks. Miss Marple tilted her head. And Mr. Marchwood? Have you noticed him? Like a man sniffing out something long buried. Mrs. Edgeworth's shears resumed their quiet snipping. He doesn't want history. He wants proof. Proof of what? Mrs. Edgeworth didn't answer. Instead, she clipped a final stem and offered it to Miss Marple. For your vase. Lavender softens a room, even one filled with suspicion. Miss Marple took it carefully. Thank you, Millicent. As she walked back toward the church path, the lavender's scent released in waves with each step, trailing behind her like a question not yet asked. At the foot of the churchyard wall, someone had placed a small stone, unremarkable to the casual passer-by. But Miss Marple stopped. Its position was deliberately resting perfectly on the corner ledge of a half-toppled grave. The inscription beneath was one she remembered: Francis Crampton, 1882-1944. Beloved but forgotten. Not a relation Emily had ever spoken of. The stone held a scrap of ribbon beneath it, violet in color, frayed at the edge. Miss Marple did not touch it, but she stood there, long enough for the village clock to strike once an odd time, neither full hour nor half. A marking of time gone sideways. Behind her, the fog coiled along the trees like memory itself. The ribbon fluttered faintly in the hush of the churchyard, its frayed end lifting as if trying to speak. Miss Marple allowed herself a brief moment of stillness, noting the grain of moss along the Crampton headstone, the way the stone had cracked along a vein years ago and never been repaired. In St. Mary Mead, even grief obeyed the rules of budget and convenience. She walked on, folding the lavender stem in her gloved hand. The village clock ticked within her like a second heartbeat. At the post office, the glass door resisted slightly before yielding. Inside, the space was as familiar as her own parlor stamps behind the wire grill, picture postcards of Devon coasts in a rack no one ever turned, and Mrs. Featherstone seated behind the counter with a ledger, opened more for propriety than function. Jane Marple, she said without looking up. What an hour to be out in this weather. I find fog clarifies the landscape, Miss Marple replied, stepping closer. When one cannot see far, one must notice near. Mrs. Featherstone adjusted her spectacles. I suppose that's one way to put it. I've always found it makes people say more than they mean. Miss Marple gave a nod of approval. A curious man staying at the Crown, I'm told. The ledger snapped shut. Marchwood. Yes. Tall fellow, polite enough but watchful. And what does he watch? Mostly people's posts. She sniffed. Ordered stationery twice, but never seems to write anything. Watch who picks up parcels. Asked after old property deeds. And yesterday, but I shouldn't. Miss Marple waited. Mrs. Featherstone sighed. Yesterday, he asked about forwarding addresses. Wanted to know if any of the old families had moved abruptly. Any in particular? The Cramptons, though he didn't say the name outright. Just asked about the family in Lavender Cottage before the war. That's them. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, I remember. Funny thing, Mrs. Featherstone continued, warming now. A week before he arrived, I received a letter with no return address. Very old paper. Postmarked from York, but the handwriting, well, it was careful. The kind of care you use when you don't want to be known. Do you still have it? I might. Miss Marple did not ask for it. People yielded more when not pressed. On her way out, she turned back. Do let me know if Mr. Marchwood sends anything. Mrs. Featherstone nodded once, gravely. The village green, when she returned to it, had emptied. The fog was lifting, not dramatically, but in soft shears, revealing angles of roofs and the curve of the bakery's awning. At the edge of the green stood Emily Crampton, arms folded, coat too thin. Miss Marple approached gently. Waiting for someone? She asked. Emily was startled. No, just walking. There's a good deal to walk away from. The girl looked at her, eyes reed-rimmed. He didn't mean to run. Miss Marple's tone remained light. One rarely does. He thought he'd ruined everything, that people wouldn't forgive. Did he? Ruin everything? Emily looked away. No, but he said he might be blamed for something one day just because he looked like he could be. People already had their minds made up. A silence passed between them. I found something, Miss Marple said softly, on your great-uncle's grave. Emily's eyes widened. Uncle Francis. A ribbon, violet, pressed under a stone. The girl's hand flew to her mouth. I didn't put it there, she said, though Miss Marple hadn't asked. I believe you. Emily hesitated. But someone knew. Miss Marple waited. He used to go there, Emily said, when he needed to think. My brother, I mean. Said Uncle Francis had been the family's vanishing point. I didn't know what he meant. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, that's what someone wanted to remind him of. They parted without further speech. Miss Marple watched her disappear toward the lane, the girl's silhouette small against the thinning mist. Appearances were all the village allowed, and it trained its children early to wear them. Back in her own sitting room, Miss Marple placed the lavender in a small cut-glass vase on the window-sill. She did not light the fire, though the air had grown damp again. Some silences were better kept cool. On the writing desk sat a faded photograph of 5 young women in hats outside the old tennis club. One of them was Mrs. Edgeworth, another Mrs. Bantry. And just to the side, smiling with crooked defiance, was Frances Crampton. She studied the faces, then turned to a bookshelf and retrieved a slim leather-bound volume, The Language of Flowers. She flipped through the fragile pages until she found what she needed. Violet. Modesty, faithfulness, remembrance. She closed the book. A knock came unexpectedly, firm. When she opened the door, she found Henry Marchwood standing on her threshold, hat in hand, expression taut with something between apology and urgency. I'm sorry to intrude, Miss Marple, but I think we need to talk. She stepped aside. Indeed we do. Marchwood crossed the threshold with a hesitation that was too measured to be clumsy. He glanced around the sitting room as if memorizing its arrangement. The pale rug, the tea service on its tray, the framed needlework declaring, "Bless this house," which Miss Marple always thought had a touch of irony in a village that was blessed so selectively. "Please do sit," she offered, motioning to the chair nearest the window. He obeyed, perching rather than settling. His coat, slightly damp, gave off the faintest scent of old wool and the outside world. "I apologize," he began. "I realize this is unorthodox." Miss Marple took her time pouring the tea, adding a slice of lemon to hers. She offered none to him. He didn't ask. "Unorthodox conversations are often the most revealing," she said mildly. Marchwood's gaze lingered on her a moment longer than politeness required. "I came here looking for someone who doesn't want to be found." Miss Marple took a sip. "That's often the most complicated kind of looking." His jaw shifted slightly. "Years ago, I was involved indirectly in a matter that never sat right with me. A young man disappeared. Quiet lad. Sensitive. I was in a position to observe nothing more. But the atmosphere around him reeked of something sour." "The atmosphere can be as persuasive as evidence," she said. Marchwood leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. He'd written to someone. A letter never posted, I suspect. I saw it only briefly, but the name stuck with me. Crampton. Miss Marple did not flinch. "And now you've come to see if the residue of that name still lingers." "I thought," he said carefully, "that if I could find his family, I might well understand something that never got explained properly." "And have you?" He exhaled slowly. "Possibly. I believe I've found his sister, Emily." "Many people have sisters," she said. Few carry their brother's burdens with such quiet desperation. He looked at her sharply. So you've noticed too? Miss Marple did not answer that. Instead, she studied him with the faintest narrowing of the eyes. Mr. Marchwood, what exactly do you suspect happened to this young man? Marchwood hesitated. I'm not sure. That's the problem. I thought once that he'd taken his own life, but then certain things didn't add up. The way he left, the way no one searched, and later a set of initials carved into a bench in a churchyard 3 counties away. Not a signature, just a mark. It made me think someone wanted to vanish, not die. A different kind of disappearance, she murmured. Yes, and if he's alive, I owe him more than curiosity. Miss Marple set her teacup down with a soft clink. And if he isn't? Marchwood's voice was quieter now. Then I'd like to know who made him vanish. The air in the room shifted, as if a window had been opened somewhere deep within the house. They sat for a moment in silence, not as strangers, but as people who understood that truth rarely comes in through the front door. Finally, Miss Marple rose and walked to the sideboard. From a drawer lined with old parish bulletins and church raffle tickets, she withdrew a small envelope and returned to him. You may find this of interest, she said, placing it gently beside his teacup. He opened it without ceremony. Inside was a torn page from an old diary, yellowed, edges brittle. The handwriting was feminine, precise. We are not what they see, but even lies must be dressed in Sunday clothes. There was no date, no name. Marchwood looked up. Where did this come from? Left in the garden room, Miss Marple said. Or rather, placed, as if someone wanted it to be half found. He studied her again. You believe someone is drawing us toward something. I believe someone is testing who notices the quiet clues. He nodded, folding the page again. And Emily? Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. Emily has seen too much and been told too little. The combination breeds silence or desperation. Marchwood stood, as if sensing the conversation was complete. Thank you, Miss Marple. She walked him to the door. As he turned to leave, she asked, Do you know the language of flowers, Mr. Marchwood? He frowned slightly. I'm afraid not. Violets, she said. They signify remembrance, but also secrets, modest ones that grow quietly in shade. He held her gaze. Perhaps that's where truth grows best, or where it hides longest. He tipped his hat and disappeared down the path. Miss Marple watched the street until he vanished into the edge of fog. She closed the door, then moved to her writing desk. With quiet precision, she opened her notebook and wrote a name on the top of a new page. Not Marchwood, not Emily, but the name of someone who hadn't appeared in any conversation, and yet whose absence rang increasingly loud. Then she underlined it. Twice. The ink from Miss Marple's fountain pen had scarcely dried when a faint tapping came at the parlor window, not loud, more of a presence announcing itself, like an afterthought hoping to be noticed. She turned, half expecting the wind, but found instead the unmistakable silhouette of Mrs. Bantry, her hat at a gallant tilt and scarf trailing like a wounded pennant. Moments later, the front door opened before a knock was needed. My dear Jane, Mrs. Bantry huffed as she entered. I've just had the most peculiar conversation with Mrs. Caldecott, and I knew you'd want to hear it before it becomes strangled into complete nonsense. Miss Marple gestured toward the tea tray. You've perfect timing. There's lemon drizzle, though the drizzle outside is decidedly less sweet. Mrs. Bantry collapsed into the armchair with the familiarity of one who never felt obliged to ask. Jane, she says she never received a parcel. Miss Marple poured calmly. No parcel at all? None. And yet Mr. Marchwood, if that is his name, claimed he was dropping one off when he came to the vicarage. I remember distinctly, said it was something for Mrs. Caldecott. Books, perhaps, or papers. "Interesting," Miss Marple said, handing over the cup. "One does not usually forget a delivery, especially when it comes bearing a stranger's interest." Mrs. Bantry sipped, then leaned in. "And the curtain, Jane. The garden-room curtain. It's not the same as it was. I would have sworn it had lace edging. Now, well, it's plain. Damask. Heavy." "Changed," Miss Marple murmured, eyes narrowing. "Or replaced?" Mrs. Bantry nodded, victorious. "Exactly." Miss Marple stood and crossed to her sideboard once more. This time she drew out a small scrapbook, the sort kept by women who enjoy the accumulation of small truths. From a plastic sleeve, she removed an old photo once taken, fittingly, at the vicarage last spring during the Easter flower arranging. "Here," she said, passing it to Mrs. Bantry. "Look at the window." The photograph showed the garden room behind a cluster of women, lilies and ribbons in their arms, and clearly, in the window lace curtains, delicately edged, faintly scalloped. Mrs. Bantry exhaled. So someone has gone to the trouble of changing them. But why? It's not as if anyone noticed until now. Miss Marple tapped the image. A different weight, a different fold might conceal or reveal more, depending on what one wished to show or to block. Mrs. Bantry frowned. "But surely you don't think someone's using curtains to communicate?" "Not communicating. Obscure. One doesn't remove or replace unless what lies behind needs protection from prying eyes, or perhaps from memory." They sat in thoughtful silence. Outside, the fog had thinned to a faint gauze, and the church spire now peeked above the roof lines like a cautious observer. "Do you remember," Miss Marple said suddenly, "the housemaid who once worked at the Crampton place? Margaret something." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "Margaret Hilling. Oh yes, stringy girl, always seemed to be polishing things that didn't shine. She left abruptly, just before the boy vanished. Said she'd taken up a position in Leeds." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "Oh, gracious. Do you think she saw something?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "I think, if someone were looking for fragments of truth in a story, long since folded away, they might start with those who were made to forget." A sharp rap at the door startled them both. This time it was Reverend Caldecott, his cassock still smudged with earth, his expression flustered. "So sorry to intrude," he began, "but Mrs. Caldecott has asked that I speak to you, Jane, that is." Miss Marple motioned him in. "Of course, Vicar. Sit down. Is she unwell?" No, he said hurriedly. But something odd. She remembered a letter. A very old letter, tucked behind a drawer in the writing desk. We hadn't opened it in years. It must have fallen back. She was looking for a birthday card, and there it was. "Whose handwriting?" Miss Marple asked. "That's just it. She says it wasn't addressed to her. Or to me. But it was inside our desk, Jane." He pulled a sealed envelope from his pocket, yellowed with age. The name on the front was faded, but legible, Miss Edith Crampton. Mrs. Bantry gasped. The aunt, the one who raised Francis after his parents died. Miss Marple accepted the letter carefully. "And inside?" Reverend Caldecott looked abashed. "I didn't open it. It's not mine to read." "Quite right," Miss Marple murmured, though she had already begun to lift the flap. The letter within was brief, written in ink that had bled slightly over time. The words, though few, carried the weight of entreaty. "Edith, please, if you still can, don't let him be sent away." It was only once. He thought he was helping. "I didn't ask for the violets." He didn't know. Miss Marple folded the letter slowly. Her eyes did not lift. Mrs. Bantry whispered, "Good heavens!" Reverend Caldecott leaned forward. Who was it from? But Miss Marple did not reply. Her fingers lingered on the paper's edge, as though trying to trace the shape of a memory. Then she rose and crossed once more to the window, drawing the curtain aside to stare out at the lane. Something in her face shifted, not realization. Not yet, but the quiet registration that one final piece had nudged itself closer. The curtain slipped back into place with a whisper, and Miss Marple turned to face the vicar and Mrs. Bantry, the folded letter still held delicately in her palm like a leaf plucked too soon. Outside, the lane had settled into a pewter calm. No footsteps, no watchers. But inside the house, tension had found its place among the floral wallpaper and ticking clock. "I think," she said gently, "we must consider that not all stories age into forgetfulness." Reverend Caldecott blinked. "You believe this is reference to violets, it connects to what's happening now?" Miss Marple gave a small nod. "I do, though whether as a cause or a consequence remains unclear." She walked to the fireless hearth and set the letter on the mantel. The handwriting belongs to a young woman, not educated but earnest. The language is an attempt to shield someone who gave a gift with unintended consequence. Mrs. Bantry furrowed her brow. "The boy. Francis." Miss Marple didn't answer directly. Instead, her gaze lifted to the mantel clock. "There's a pattern to kindness misunderstood, especially in a place like St. Mary Mead." The vicar shifted in his chair. "You mean to say something happened? A misunderstanding?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured. "Or perhaps something was made to look like one." She moved to the writing desk, opened its top drawer, and retrieved her small black notebook. She turned a few pages, then tapped her pencil against one line. "Mr. Marchwood mentioned initials on a bench, and now this letter appears meant for a woman who died years ago. I wonder," she said thoughtfully, "if someone has been planting these memories." "Planting?" Mrs. Bantry repeated. "Like staging?" "Precisely. Staging grief, or guilt, or absolution, not for the village but for someone still watching the village." A silence settled like snow. Then the vicar coughed and said, with the faltering conviction of a man unused to deception, "Would you like me to make inquiries?" "No," Miss Marple said. "Not yet. Too much noise now would scatter things that have only just begun to take shape." She saw them out with murmured thanks, and once alone she moved to the tall cupboard in the hall and retrieved her umbrella. The air outside had turned sharp, the fog now only a high gauze overhead, letting in a chilled clarity. Her path took her through the heart of the village, where windows began lighting one by one with the early fall of evening. Outside Lavender Cottage, the curtains were drawn tight, but a faint glow bled through yellow, flickering like a candle or a fire barely maintained. She did not stop. Instead, she turned up toward the old Crampton property, Oakdean House Long, empty, its garden now tangled with rose hips and ivy. The gate hung on one hinge. The postbox had rusted to a brittle hue, but it still bore the nameplate E. Crampton. Miss Edith had died nearly 6 years ago. The house had remained untouched. Miss Marple pushed gently at the gate. It gave with a soft creak. No sign of disturbance, yet she knew better than to trust stillness. The side path, choked with wet leaves, led toward the garden rooms, another one the Cramptons had built theirs a generation before the vicarage added its own. Here, the glass was smeared, but not broken. Inside, shadows clung to the corners. She cupped her hands and peered through. A shape moved, not in the room but deeper through a hallway, glimpsed only as a ripple in the gloom. She didn't linger, not from fear, but from principle. One never knocked before the truth was ready. As she retraced her steps, she noted a small pile of earth by the path, recently turned, and next to it, the corner of a handkerchief, damp with something embroidered in the corner. Just 2 initials. She leaned down, but did not touch it. F.C. Francis Crampton. The ground beneath the earth was uneven, not wide, not deep, but disturbed. She stood for a long moment. Then she looked up slowly to the second-story window of the house. A curtain had moved. Not fluttered. Moved. She turned and left, footsteps deliberate, each one pressing against the gravel like a question with no answer yet offered. Back near the green, she passed Leonard Tegg, who tipped his cap and said, "Evening, Miss Marple. It's a bit late to be out." She smiled. The best time for certain truths to come out is when the village thinks it's already gone to bed. He grinned, uncertain whether she was joking. She paused. "Tell me, Leonard, do you happen to know if anyone's entered Oakdean House recently?" He scratched his head. "Not that I know, but funny you ask. Got a call 2 days ago about someone poking round the back garden. No sign when I arrived. No complaint filed? No name left. Just a girl's voice on the line. Could have been a prank." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "No such thing as a prank when it comes to buried things, Leonard. They don't stay buried without help." As he pondered that, she continued on, drawing her coat tighter. A figure waited at the end of the green, not moving, just a present. As she approached, the figure stepped forward. Emily. Her hands were clenched in her pockets. Her face was pale. "I didn't know where else to go," she said. Miss Marple stopped. "Then I think," she replied softly, "we're almost ready to begin." Emily's coat sleeves were damp at the cuffs, her breathing shallow but controlled, as if she'd rehearsed the act of not trembling. She didn't speak immediately, nor did Miss Marple press her. Instead, they stood together in the hush between gas lamps, the village now holding its breath like a theater between acts. Finally, the girl glanced sideways. "You saw someone, didn't you?" "In the house." Miss Marple's response was quiet. A movement, a presence, more than a figure. Emily looked down at her shoes. "I used to go there after school. The garden always smelled of old mint and paint. My aunt would make me sit quietly on the window seat and say nothing while she read the paper." "Your aunt, Miss Marple," prompted gently. "Edith. Francis's guardian. She wasn't unkind, just watchful. Everything had its place, and if something moved, it was noticed." They began walking, slowly, toward the lane that curled behind the churchyard. The grass here was slick with dew, the path strewn with old chestnut shells cracking underfoot. "He never liked the garden room," Emily continued. "Said it was a stage. The people came in, played their parts, then left pretending nothing had happened." Miss Marple nodded. "And what happened there?" Emily stopped. "I think someone made him feel like he'd done something shameful. But he hadn't. I was too young to understand then, but later you begin to hear things. Adults forget children are listening." They paused beneath a twisted yew tree where the shadow of the church fell long across the path. "I think," Emily said, "he gave someone the violet. That it meant something innocent to him, but not to them." Miss Marple's gaze settled on her, and that misunderstanding was useful to someone else. Emily swallowed. "Mrs. Featherstone said you found a letter." "I did, and I believe it was never meant to be read by its addressee. Perhaps never even meant to be sent. Just written, then hidden. But someone found it now, after all this time, and placed it where it would be found intentionally." Emily looked up, something flickering behind her eyes. "You think they're still here?" "Whoever did it." Miss Marple didn't answer directly. "I think someone has returned. Not to confess, but to control the story before someone else tells it." They walked on until they reached the vicarage path. The lights were out now in the drawing room, and only the porch lamp glowed like a distant star. Miss Marple gestured for them to continue past it. "In the last few days," she said, "we've had a glove, a pressed flower, a torn note, a curtain changed, and a handkerchief left in soil that had been disturbed. Too carefully disturbed, if you ask me." Emily was silent, absorbing the list not as facts, but as memories reframed. At the garden's edge, Miss Marple stopped beside the sundial, its surface slick and unreadable under the moonlight. "Tell me," she said, "did your aunt have a strong reaction when Francis left?" Emily nodded slowly. She closed the house, boarded the windows, said it wasn't worth letting strangers. I never saw her cry, but once I found her burning a photograph in the coal stove. Of Francis? No, of a woman I didn't recognize. Pretty, with short hair. I only caught a glimpse before the flame took it. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed just slightly. Not a local face. Emily shook her head. No, but I remember one thing, her brooch. It was shaped like a bell. Silver. There was a pause. "Jane," came a voice from the shadows. They turned to find Mrs. Edgeworth approaching, wrapped in a thick shawl and wearing the look of someone who had deliberately walked into something inevitable. "Forgive me," she said. "I saw you from my window." I thought perhaps her gaze rested on Emily, softened and then sharpened again. "You ought to know, Jane, that I've just had a caller." Miss Marple arched an eyebrow. "Indeed. A man. Said he was a friend of Edith Crampton's from years ago, claimed he was doing a little heritage research, but he knew too much. Asked whether I remembered the day Francis left. Asked whether I thought it had been sudden. And did you?" Mrs. Edgeworth glanced toward Emily before answering. "I thought it had been orchestrated." Emily looked stricken. Miss Marple's voice cut gently. "You mean arranged, not by Francis, but for him?" Mrs. Edgeworth nodded. "I always wondered. Edith was many things, but subtle wasn't one of them. That departure was tidied up too quickly. Letters gone. The school told not to expect him back." Miss Marple glanced at Emily, who had gone pale. "And now someone is rehearsing the scene again," she murmured. Mrs. Edgeworth's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Miss Marple said, "someone is attempting to restage the very disappearance they once crafted. But the props are different now. The hands are less steady, the emotions closer to the surface." She looked up at the dark, windows of Oakdean House, its chimneys like frozen watchmen, and no play can be perfectly repeated without something new breaking through the script. Emily's hands were shaking now, though she tried to hide it in her sleeves. "If they're trying to rewrite what happened—" Miss Marple touched her arm. "Then we must be the ones to turn the page first." Emily stood very still, and for a moment the sound of the wind catching in the yew branches made it seem as though someone's whispering was just out of reach. Miss Marple, steady and unhurried, glanced between the girl and Mrs. Edgeworth, her expression unreadable but somehow more acute for its calm. "We'll walk you home," she said at last, not as a suggestion, but as a verdict. The three women moved quietly through the now silver-tinged lanes. The moon, free of fog for the first time in days, shone weakly on the old stones and slate rooftops, rendering the familiar village unfamiliar again. Edges sharpened, corners deepened. Emily's breath clouded the air in short, anxious bursts. She didn't speak. Neither did Mrs. Edgeworth. But Miss Marple's silence held the rhythm of calculation, not discomfort. Lavender Cottage, when they reached it, looked unchanged. Curtains drawn, porch light extinguished, chimney trailing only the faintest line of smoke. Yet as Miss Marple's fingers brushed the latch of the gate, she paused. "Would your mother be asleep by now?" she asked. Emily hesitated. "She always says she is, but I think she just lies there." Miss Marple gave a single nod, then stepped forward. "Let's not wake her just yet. Would you mind if we went round the back?" Emily blinked. "The back? I find," Miss Marple said softly, "that some truths prefer the side entrance." The back garden was modest with 2 moss-covered paving stones, a dormant rosemary bush, and a shed that leaned as though perpetually eavesdropping. Miss Marple moved with the poise of someone who had memorized the creek patterns of every stile in the county. She gestured to the rear parlor window. This used to be your aunt's sitting room, didn't it? Emily nodded. She always sat by the window, said light should come in even when people didn't. Miss Marple stepped closer. The window, though curtained, was ajar by the smallest crack, enough to let in cold or a whisper. Inside, the room was dim but not dark. A fire had burned low. On the window seat, a cushion bore a faint indentation. A book lay face down beside it, the folded bell, its title half obscured in the fabric's shadow. Miss Marple's voice was barely audible. Francis used to sit here. Emily's voice was nearly as quiet. When she let him, mostly he watched. What did he see? Things no one else did. Miss Marple's hand drifted toward the windowsill. There, almost hidden in the corner where the paint had begun to peel, a small button rested. Dark blue, thread still attached. She picked it up gently, then turned to Emily. Did this come from his coat? The girl frowned. I think so. He had one like that. Navy. He wore it for confirmation. Never liked it. Mrs. Edgeworth, watching from just behind, took a half step forward. And yet here it is, left behind, as if removed deliberately. Miss Marple didn't speak. Her gaze lingered on the button, then shifted to the half-open window. The weight of placement not lost, but placed was unmistakable. Someone was reconstructing something not to remember, but to rewrite. Inside, a faint soundboard shifting, or something heavier, prompted Emily to start. She turned to Miss Marple, her voice hushed. She said she was resting. People often are, Miss Marple said, when they need not be questioned. With surprising decisiveness, she led them through the garden door and into the narrow hallway. The scent inside was sharp lavender polish and something sour beneath. The parlor lay just ahead. Miss Marple entered first. The fire had died entirely now. The book had not moved. But the window seat bore not just the cushion and book, but now placed as though awaiting a pressed violet. It had not been there moments ago. Emily gasped. That wasn't when we looked. No, Miss Marple said. It wasn't. Mrs. Edgeworth crossed herself unconsciously. The violet was fragile but perfectly intact, a twin to the one found at the vicarage. The careful presentation, the deliberate echo, it reeked not of nostalgia, but of choreography. Miss Marple did not touch it. Instead, she turned toward the staircase. I think it's time we spoke with your mother, she said. Emily hesitated, then nodded. They ascended quietly. The upper hallway was cooler, darker. At the end stood a closed door, and as Emily reached for the knob, Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on her wrist. Let me, she said. The door creaked open with theatrical reluctance. Inside, Mrs. Crampton sat upright in bed, her dressing gown draped over her knees, a teacup untouched beside her. She did not look surprised to see them. I wondered, she said, how long it would take you? Miss Marple inclined her head. Some performances require time to understand their stage directions. Mrs. Crampton's lips thinned. That house was a mistake. She should never have kept him there. He was soft. Too soft. Emily stepped back, visibly stunned. Mother, but Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. You knew about the letters, she said calmly. You knew about the violet. And you've been watching the movement since Marchwood arrived. I've been protecting what's left, Mrs. Crampton snapped, from being picked over. Miss Marple studied her for a long moment, then spoke, almost to herself. And yet the pieces were never really scattered, were they? Mrs. Crampton looked away. Beneath the bed, the floor creaked. Emily's breath caught. Miss Marple's voice was softer now. You're not alone in this house tonight, are you? The creak beneath the bed was not loud, but it was undeniable. It cut through the silence like the drawing back of a velvet curtain before a final act. Miss Marple did not flinch. She stepped forward, her calm as deliberate as her lace-trimmed cuffs. Mrs. Crampton's eyes darted just once to the floorboards. Emily, Miss Marple said gently, without turning her head. "Step outside. Please." "No," the girl whispered. "No, only for a moment, dear. There are truths a mother must speak without her daughter's eyes upon her." Mrs. Edgeworth guided Emily back with a hand at her elbow, and the door clicked shut behind them. Miss Marple knelt slowly, methodically, and drew back the corner of the crocheted bedspread. With her gloved hand, she knocked once, sharply, on the floorboards. A pause, then a shuffle, and then a low voice. "Don't be afraid." The panel slid open with more ease than expected, revealing a crawl space barely large enough to turn in. And there, pale, thin, blinking against the candle-lit dimness of the room, was Francis Crampton. Miss Marple offered him her hand. He emerged like a man returning from a country where language had grown rusted. His clothes were neat, but not new. The navy coat missing a button hung from his shoulders, like borrowed time. His face bore the strange calm of someone long prepared to be found. "I told her," he said, nodding toward the bed. "When I came back, I told her I wouldn't speak, that I didn't want trouble." Miss Marple helped him to a chair and then turned toward Mrs. Crampton, who sat with hands clasped tightly on her lap, her knuckles white. "You kept him here," she said, "not to protect him, but to protect yourself." Mrs. Crampton said nothing. Miss Marple's voice softened. "You believed he had done something, years ago, something shameful, something that could ruin your name. Edith feared it too, but the fear was misplaced." Francis spoke quietly. "It was the violet. That's where it started. I gave it to Michael. He was the vicar's nephew, just visiting. He dropped his hymn book, and I'd found the flower pressed inside. I returned it with a note. I thought it was cleaned. He was upset. But someone else saw it," Miss Marple said, "and used it." Mrs. Crampton's voice cracked. "Edith said it would ruin everything, that people would think that he was like that, and she wouldn't allow it. So we wrote the letter. Made it seem as though he'd chosen to leave. Packed a bag. Told the school. And when he resisted, she locked me in the garden room," Francis said. "Then moved me here. And after Edith died, he stopped." His hand went briefly to his temple. "I didn't have anywhere else to go." Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Crampton. "You staged the rediscovery of it all, the glove, the pressed flower, the note. You thought if the story were rewritten now, decades later, you could control the way it ended. Make him the tragic soul, the misunderstood recluse who never quite fit, but never the one you feared he might become." Mrs. Crampton's expression did not change. "I was trying to protect him." "No," Miss Marple said, her voice firm. "You were trying to protect your memory of who he was. The boy who didn't embarrass you. The son who fit. And when he returned, quiet and alive, you didn't know what to do with that reality. So you buried it again. In plain sight." Francis looked up at her then. "I never meant to be a scandal." Miss Marple's gaze held his. "You weren't. But others made you one." He nodded once, slowly. Downstairs, a clock struck 9. The sound drifted through the floor like a signal to lower the curtain. "Emily should come in now," Miss Marple said. When the girl entered and saw him, really saw him, she did not speak. She walked straight to the chair and knelt beside him. Her hands reached for his, and the weight of years pressed between them, finally uncontained. Mrs. Edgeworth, ever the sentinel, remained in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "it's time the room in the garden was opened again. Properly. Let it breathe." Mrs. Crampton stared at her for a long moment. Then, with the weariness of someone whose reflection has at last caught up, she nodded. No police were called that evening. There was no public revelation, no scandal paraded in the parish newsletter. In St. Mary Mead, truths were not shouted. They were absorbed, quietly, like tea stains into linen. 3 days later, the curtain in the garden room was changed again. The lace returned, ironed and spotless. A single violet, fresh this time, sat on the windowsill. Francis did not leave the cottage. He took long walks in the early morning when few were about, and sometimes one could see him reading on the bench behind the churchyard, beneath the yew. The initials on the bench had long since faded, but he seemed to know exactly where they had been. Mrs. Crampton did not speak of it, not to the vicar, nor to Mrs. Price Ridley, who sniffed suspiciously but received no explanation. Respectability, once shaken, was not spoken of again. It was simply dusted down and stood upright once more. Emily resumed her job at the bookshop in Much Benham. Mrs. Edgeworth, in a rare gesture, began stopping by the cottage with preserves. As for Mr. Marchwood, he vanished as suddenly as he'd arrived, left a note at the Crown, thanking the landlord for his hospitality and expressing interest in returning during spring. Miss Marple suspected he would not. She sat one morning on her own garden bench, knitting in hand, eyes resting on the horizon as the fog gave way to a thin, forgiving sun. She thought of Francis, not of his disappearance, nor his return, but of the stillness he carried now, a stillness not of defeat, but of having survived the silence others had forced upon him. Miss Marple had seen many crimes in her time, some with blood, others with money at the root. But the ones that lingered longest, that refused to settle, were those of moral cowardice, of families folding themselves into smaller shapes so they could continue to fit the mold they believed the world expected of them. And yet, despite it all, violets still bloomed. She tucked her needles into her bag and rose. The church bell chimed somewhere beyond the hedgerow. Another morning began, another village peace restored on the surface. But deep beneath, she thought, human nature remained as knotted and delicate as ever.